Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast. I'm your host, Christian Harris. I'm delighted to be joined this week by Michele Wucker, who is a strategist and a best-selling author on the subject of risk management. Her most recent book, which was released in the last 18 months, is called You Are What You Risk. Michele and I talk, therefore, about the topic of risk management, and we discuss things such as what's Michele's definition of risk and how that definition of risk is really important to understand for different people, and why that is, because we all have a slightly definition of the word. We talk, as I'm sure you'd expect, if you think about risk right now, then the word Ukraine must come to the top of your mind. So we talk about that, and Michele wrote a great article about that on LinkedIn a couple of days ago, earlier this week as well. And then we get into some of the themes in Michele's most recent book. We talk about the new world of work. We talk about risk appetite and culture building around risk within businesses. And then we talk a bit about the grey rhino theory as well as lots more in between. Really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure you will too. At the end, Michele will mention her books. We reference them throughout the discussion as well. Do check the links in the show notes for ways to get hold of those, and connect with Michele on LinkedIn and Twitter, and give this episode some love on social media as well. With that then, let's get into it and join my conversation with Michele Wucker. Cheers. Welcome to the podcast, Michele. Great to have you here.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
It's nice to have a distinguished best-selling author on the podcast.
I'm still not quite used to those words in front of my name. I'm not complaining, but it's really kind of what every author wishes for.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So you've written two very successful books about risk. So first question. I mean, how do you define risk? What does risk mean to you?
Well, it's such a great question. I ask it in a lot of the corporate workshops where I do, and I get completely different answers from different people.
That's why I'm interested to hear what you say.
It's amazing. I mean, for me, it's really a mix. It's about making a choice. A choice could go the way you want, or it could very much not go the way you want. But it's a mix of sort of hope and fear, of danger and opportunity, as they say. And it's the kind of thing that really depends. And the thing that's really come through for me is that risk means something completely different to everyone, not just depending on their profession or their experiences or their personality, but it evolves throughout their life. As they have more and more experiences, they either become more comfortable or more afraid of certain risks. And then looking at risk it's like Schrodinger's cat. It's like its state depends on whether you observe it or how you observe it or not. It's constantly moving. I often talk about it like a room full of funhouse mirrors, because the very act of perceiving a risk has the power to push you to do things that minimize that risk. And so you get this feedback loop. So it's a term that's everywhere. It's in our lives every single day, but it's so hard to put your finger on it.
It is, and I think that's one of the problems, isn't it? Because you can talk, as you said you do, to people in a corporation, or you could stop 100 people on the high street and say, what does risk mean to you? And you'd probably get 100 different answers. So therefore, risk management as a sort of profession, I guess, is quite a difficult thing to navigate.
It is. And, it's funny, I do a lot of work with insurance companies, and I get very different responses there from a more general audience, say. And I've started asking people, of course, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And they love to talk about that. But people started coming back to me going, okay, Michele, smarty pants, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And I started to describe it to them. And I realized, wait a minute, that was actually not the biggest risk in the situation. It was sort of like a health versus job dilemma. Right. And I realized that was not the biggest risk in front of me, that the thing that looked to other people like it was the biggest risk, in my mind, was far less risky than the supposedly safe path. And that's something very few people recognize in time about their lives that the safe path isn't always as safe as we think it is.
Mm. I mean, it just shows the perception issue, doesn't it? Because when you were saying that, I was thinking, well, what would I answer to that question? And I suppose I'd probably have to answer setting up my business, maybe, because obviously you do take a lot of risks when you're doing that, because it can fail, and there's financial and reputational and emotional risks of that going wrong. But then if you look at it from someone else's perspective, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, and I know that's something we can talk about a bit, but somebody else might think, well, yeah, but of course you're going to set up your own business because you're an expert in this subject and you've got this entrepreneurial spirit, and so again, it's how you look at the same problem from different sides can come with a different answer.
And being an expert in a certain subject doesn't always lend itself to being great at
Mm.
business. I mean, there are a lot of authors or speakers who are really great at the content and the thinking, the deep thoughts. But when it comes to the business side, maybe not so much. And of course, I've run organizations, I've managed teams and organizations, have had some training in those areas. So there are certain things I know how to do and, advise other people on how to think about certain challenges. But, when it comes to myself, I mean, my talent is really in the ideas, in the thinking, and like other people who are more creative, the business side itself isn't always nearly as much fun doing it yourself as when you're looking through the outside, because of course often you can see problems from the outside much more clearly than people who've had their head in it all day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I must say, I'm probably similarly minded to you, and the last sort of few months where I've had taken the decision to get more support on the ops side and the finance side and things like that. Everything's kind of moving along in a much more serene manner than it was before, with me sort of trying to wear all of those hats. So perhaps actually the biggest risk wasn't starting the business; it was trying to run the business for too long with with me wearing too many hats that I wasn't suited to.
That's a problem for a lot of solopreneurs. It's
Yeah.
amazing. And, actually this starting a business kind of thing, running a business is really a mix of all of the elements of risk perception and how they shape your decisions. I mean, it's your innate personality. I think entrepreneurs tend to be somewhat more optimistic, although they're saying that, immigrant or refugee entrepreneurs who start their business because it's really the only thing to do. They don't have the networks in the new place where they are, and it's done by necessity. And I think those of us who do it by choice are very, very lucky. There's some research that shows that entrepreneurs tend to do a lot more homework and research. They talk to people, they make sure that they've got more knowledge about the situation. And knowledge is a great part of this risk feedback loop. The more knowledge you have, on the one hand, the more confident you are, and the more likely you are to do something. But on the other hand, it also makes you more likely to succeed because you know what you're doing. And there's also research that shows that entrepreneurs believe that they are going to succeed more than other people do, and also more than the average success rate of a
Yeah.
business, which is a little
Yeah.
scary. But a lot of people have this idea of entrepreneurs as these huge risk takers. But when you look at the risk calculus, a lot of people come out of a job with the boss who's a control freak who can't make up their mind, or who had a great boss who all of a sudden went on to someplace better, and they all of a sudden feel shaky, and they've got this one source of income. There have been studies of solopreneurs and freelancers who say that they feel that by diversifying their sources of income and by controlling their sources of income, they actually feel less at risk than they did working for the man.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very and it's just the human makeup, isn't it, and how we're all different, and yeah, fascinating subject. So we're recording this in early March of 2022, and if you again took a straw poll about risk at the moment and what's the biggest risk facing the world, I suspect that most people will be talking about Ukraine. And you did a great article a couple of days ago on LinkedIn. Don't know if you want to just maybe summarize some of your thinking about this sort of crazy situation, or is it crazy situation? Perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it was a foreseen risk.
It's, it really is crazy. It's brought up these sort of existential risks that a lot of people didn't grow up with. It's the older generations that did. But I mean, reading these stories about runs on iodine pills in Europe because people want to protect themselves. But what happens is that whenever there's a big event, it happened with the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal and the pandemic and the Texas freeze and all these things, where I get a deluge of tweets and messages and emails from people going, was this the gray rhino? Was this a gray rhino? And journalists love to ask this, was this a gray rhino or a black swan? And it drives me absolutely bonkers because you can only see a black swan in hindsight, because by definition, it's unforeseeable, it's unimaginable. And once you can think of the possibility of something happening, it's not a black swan anymore.
Yeah.
And the gray rhino is meant to be a forward-looking concept. And so I'm like, it's helpful to look and see, okay, what did we do wrong? What could we have done better? What can we learn from this? That's great. Are there people we need to hold accountable and responsible for this? But you can only really hold someone responsible if people have been talking about a risk ahead of time. And so I tend to tell journalists when they ask me this, is it a gray rhino question, is I try to change the conversation to get it to look forward. And in many cases, the pandemic and certainly Ukraine have revealed gray rhinos that many people saw, and in many cases intensified them. Like the pandemic has really intensified a lot of our awareness of financial fragilities, of inequality, of climate change, which is sort of the trio of big policy issues that I'm fairly obsessed with. And Ukraine similarly, yes, if you look back and you look at the history since 2008 and even before, obviously there was a possibility that this could happen, and some people actually thought it was a likelihood. Nobody knows exactly when, nobody but Putin knew exactly what day they were going to attack Ukraine. And there are lots of things that we don't know. And there's lots of things that we can see as possibilities going forward, from energy crisis situations to an escalation of hostilities. I hope that doesn't work. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But what I also ask, when I get people to look forward, is I say, okay, now that we see that this is here, who's got the power to do something about it? Who's affected by it? Who are the key stakeholders? And where are they? Do they recognize this? Do they have a clear solution? Are they just kind of sitting on their hands? Are they running around in circles, waving their hands and screaming, do something, anybody just do something? Or, are they acting and seeing how things work and moving forward? And that's been very, very interesting to see among governments, among businesses, and among individuals. I mean, you've seen, Switzerland, which is like pretty much the definition of impartial, has come out and condemned the situation. And the World Economic Forum, which has been very, very careful about not getting in the middle of political things, has come out and expressed its support for Ukraine. You've seen companies withdrawing from Russia at huge, huge costs. One oil company was saying it might have to take a charge off of $25 billion with a B. And so we're seeing a lot of responses. We don't know yet how well they're going to work or not. We're seeing a mix of bad cop and good cop responses. But it's a very frightening situation, I have to say.
Yeah, it is. I mean, particularly living in Europe, and yeah, you would never have expected to have a war in Europe. It's I mean, my wife and some of the parents from our son's school, we did a big collection, and a few of them went in and sort of bagged up loads of stuff to send off to Poland. And it's just, I don't know, it is weird because and crazy, because you kind of expect, not that it's a good thing that this happens or that it's any, worse or whatever, but you kind of expect to be sending aid packages to far-flung places in the third world, but not to a European country. And it is very scary. My next door neighbour's American, and he's got his wife's family's from Wales, and he was saying, I'm thinking of moving to Wales for a few weeks just to see how things shake out, because I'm worried that there's going to be Putin's going to launch a nuclear attack on London. It's wow, that's escalated quickly.
Well, it's interesting. I gave a talk last week with a Chicago organization that had been about to host a delegation of Ukrainian entrepreneurs and students that had been en route. And they had just gotten word that the group turned around. They were transferring airports and they were like, no, we're going back to Ukraine. And that was absolutely amazing to me, because they would have been so much safer in Chicago. And, I hear, obviously we've got, nearly 1 million refugees and counting, but we're also hearing of a lot of people going back to Ukraine and saying, hey, I want to defend this. I want to support this. A group of us were talking with a friend in Kiev on over the weekend, who was telling us what was going on, and then said, guys, I have to go right now. The sirens are going. And we were all very nervous for a little while until he messaged us that he was okay. But it's a very real and very scary situation. A lot of uncertainty, and there's a real relationship between risk and uncertainty. And I think we need to, people need to realize whether it's taking a risk that we are not comfortable with or are comfortable with, or whether it's just the uncertainty, the not knowing what is going to happen. And so a lot of really training yourself to build up your risk muscles, to be better at taking risks and making good decisions, also involves figuring out how to make it through in very uncertain situations where you don't know what's going to happen. And that's been the whole world the last 2 years in ways that most of us had never seen before.
Yeah. I mean, it shines a light on risk appetite, doesn't it? This situation, because like the people you spoke of, those entrepreneurs going back to defend their country, and the Klitschko brothers, the boxers, and various other people who, don't have to do this. They could probably, Zelensky himself, was offered to leave, wasn't he? The US said they'd airlift him out, and he said, no, the fight's here and I'm going to stay. And it's just interesting how your definition of risk, I suppose, or your willingness, your tolerance for risk, when you're under these extreme pressures or these extreme situations, can just totally go out of the window, and you're willing to do something which, under normal circumstances, you would never, ever do. You wouldn't be standing fronting up to an army, would you, normally?
No, and it's amazing what, how the world has recognized that. One of my arguments in You Are What You Risk, my new book, the sequel to The Gray Rhino, is that the risks that you take and the choices that you make tell the world who you are as distinctively as a fingerprint, like a biometric marker. And this really tells the world who Ukrainians are and who the businesses are who step up and say, hey, I'm going to do something about this, and who the countries are. And, risk is really about what you're willing to lose and what you're willing to do anything to defend.
Yeah. That's a great definition. So I will ask you about the book, because we've got to sell some copies. So when we were chatting before, you mentioned there were a couple of chapters or a couple of topics within the You Are What You Risk book that hadn't been covered much by other interviews. So I thought, right, come on, let's grab the bull by the horns. And the first one actually comes off of what you were just saying about companies. So it's kind of around risk and organizational culture. I actually interviewed Jeff Trickey, who I think I'm pretty sure
he's in the book.
Yeah, he's in the book.
One of my favorite people to talk to. I actually went down to Tunbridge Wells to interview him for the book.
Perfect. So I interviewed him about his risk type compass, and that was interesting. So yeah, one of the questions was going to be, to what extent did that his work kind of influence some of your thinking around corporations and how to organize businesses around risk?
Yeah, well, Jeff told me some amazing stories. And of course, the risk type compass is a psychometric test for how you deal with risk, and really on two axes, how calm or anxious you are and how impulsive or methodical. And he said a couple of things that were interesting. One was that people tend to end up in clusters in certain professions, but also when they would do the test with a whole board and do a sort of a scatter plot of, who was in which area, people with similar risk types were sitting next to each other. They sort of sorted out that way. And I think a lot of us do tend to gravitate towards people with similar risk attitudes, but we don't always appreciate just how important it is to have a diverse set of risk types, risk personalities, risk experiences, and processes and habits for dealing with risk. You hear a lot about board diversity, and certainly people talk about gender and age and background and demographics and skills and all of those things. But we don't talk as explicitly as I feel we should about risk, about how sensitive each person is to risk. Two people can see the same thing and one person's like, and another person freaks out. Yeah. I mean, for me, like, jaywalking, I'm super cautious about jaywalking, despite having lived in New York City for 23 years. And that combination is so important. And, I spoke with a trading coach who Jeff hooked me up with. And he was talking about how there was one team of traders, the high performing team. And one guy was this sort of, leap before you look type. And the other person was a lot more measured and cautious. And that combination, that sort of sharing of the best of each world created this wonderful, wonderful dynamic. Or I've got a friend where, she's a very successful entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, amazing things. And, he had the same job for decades. And she says, anything more exotic than a mutual fund, and he flips out. And, in that case, it was a really good match, but not everybody appreciates those differences. And so sometimes you'll get two people with very similar personalities, like Mark Pollock and Simone George, who were also interviewed in the book from Dublin. And they're both these just charge ahead personalities. She's a dynamic lawyer, and he's been an adventurer. And they're both trying to cure paralysis. Yeah, no big deal. Yeah. Not an ambitious goal at all. And, they do well together, but they, I think they realize that sometimes it's helpful to have someone from the outside to kind of help them to evaluate things. And I think for any team, that's hugely important. And in the broader corporate context, I mean, you see startups where it's, move fast and break things, or you see these sort of bureaucratic, stultified legacy corporations where nobody can get anything done. And, the biggest risk is not doing the way we've always done things, quote unquote. Yeah. And those cultures are so different. And so it affects M&A, it affects strategy going forward, it affects innovation, creativity, and also risk management, whether the company sees something coming or not. Because one of the things that's really struck me is that often people see heading off a risk as a bigger risk than doing nothing, which of course makes sense. They don't want to be the person who made the wrong decision. Yeah. They'd rather be wrong with everybody else rather than being right alone, because it's scary to do. So risk in organizational culture is so important, both in identifying the red flags and the warnings, but also in pursuing opportunities and accepting that not all of those are going to go the way you want. And so accepting a certain amount of failure as normal.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's this kind of tipping point, as I see it, where, as you say, you start off in this kind of startup mode where everything's about fail quickly and move on and pivot and so on. So it's all about taking a risk, and nobody starts a business without taking risk. So you've got that certain level of risk tolerance, and then as a business grows and evolves, it reaches this point. I don't know exactly when it is, but all of a sudden risk becomes a bad thing, and as you say, nobody wants to stick their head above the parapet, and it's all about you don't get fired for hiring IBM. It's that kind of, and you become very risk averse, and that sort of stifles innovation, stifles growth. It's very, very interesting. I mean, I saw a statistic or read a statistic once that I think it was something like 85 or 90% of the Fortune 500 in sort of 1940 or something are no longer in business, because you kind of got to this point and tried to stick to the tried and tested formula, and the world changed and they didn't.
It's true. It's true. And it's, it has to do with this ability to pivot. You look at some of the companies that have lasted the longest, and they're not necessarily making what they were making when they started. And, I was hearing these stories about breweries in Ukraine now making Molotov cocktails.
Yeah, yeah.
That's quite a pivot.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, didn't we? With sort of breweries making hand sanitizer and things like that. But yeah, they've gone a stage further.
There was one right near me, Koval in Chicago, which was one of the pioneers of that. And it's important, the companies that have been able to pivot, to be a little bit more flexible, have been the ones that have survived the pandemic. I wrote about Waffles and Dingus, which is that they've got these amazing waffle trucks, they started out in New York and they've expanded now, and they had just started going into bricks and mortar buildings. Then they had an expansion plan. There were a couple that they were about to open when, middle of March 2020, the sort of stay-at-home orders started coming down, and they flipped out. And but they were able to bring the business back by doing two things. One was getting inviting customers to support donations of waffles from the trucks to frontline healthcare workers, which was amazing. And then the other thing was that they really built up the online, the remote part of their business. And they really focused on, okay, how are we going to bring joy to people? And they had done that during Hurricane Sandy as well, that they brought waffles and ice cream and all sorts of good things to the workers and to people who were stranded because of the floods. And we're seeing a lot of businesses now being much more proactive when there is a disaster, figuring out how they can help, sort of putting everything else on hold for a couple of minutes and going in and really using their skills that they've got built up to try to make a situation better. And I hope we see more of that in the world.
Well, Elon Musk in Ukraine being a good example, turning on the, I can't remember the name of it now, but the internet service, satellite internet service. Yeah, good example. Yeah, interestingly, one of my clients is a restaurant chain, and they pivoted towards the Deliveroo, Uber Eats kind of model, obviously because they had to close, and now they're finding that that's such a large proportion of their business that it's actually inhibiting the trading in the restaurants that are open, because people are sort of sitting there waiting for their food, and in that time they're waiting, they're seeing a flurry of Deliveroo orders coming out the door. So they're now having to change their model and create additional kitchens near to existing restaurants. So they're doubling the kitchen space, one for delivery, one for traditional bricks and mortar restaurants. So yeah, it's lots of ongoing pivoting happening as well.
And I think, I was just reading about a couple of businesses that had gone mainly online, and they're starting to see that mix of online versus in-person shifting, as the mask orders come off and people feel more confident about the vaccinations and things. So I think we're going to see a lot more pivoting in the next year or two.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that I mean, it's almost like this was planned, but that's a great segue into the other topic that you mentioned, has been not neglected, but hasn't been talked about as much from the book, which is around the future of work. And yeah, that's a great example there, where everything's still changing. How do we deal with this? I mean, what I see is, and I think there's something generational about this as well, that people are drawn to in a much more what's the right way of saying this? A much stronger way. I won't use a pejorative term. Companies that seem to be doing the right thing on the environment and workers' rights and all this other stuff. So I think that we're going to see a big shift in terms of retention of staff and retention of customers and so on and so forth going forward. If you're doing the right things, quote unquote. What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The book came out before two of these huge trends that I see, which is, the great resignation, where we're seeing record numbers every month of people, leaving their jobs and moving. And when I was finishing the book, it was, of course, still during the pandemic. And the conversation was more about social safety net for restaurant workers, for frontline workers, healthcare workers and others who, all of a sudden had this urgent need for childcare, or who all of a sudden couldn't work because of no fault of their own. And so we saw some changes in social safety net policies that would have been completely taboo, particularly in the United States, just months before that. And so as of when the book came out, it came out like a couple of weeks before I was able to get my first vaccine. So I was really excited about that. So people were starting to come out. It was right before Delta. And it was, I guess like during last summer that you started to hear these stories of a lot of these, restaurant workers, retail workers saying, I'm not going to come back and have to, argue with some guy who's going to beat me up because I asked them to please wear a mask, or they're just looking at the risks, the physical health risks of those jobs and saying, hey, the risk reward is not enough here. I'm not getting paid what I should. And then beyond that, you're seeing all of these memes of, text exchanges between workers and their bosses being jerks, and the workers just saying, take this job and shove it. And, people are making those trade-offs saying, I don't want to be in a job with an emotionally abusive boss. I don't want to be in a job where I feel like I'm not going anywhere. And I want to be in a job where there's something fulfilling, where I can see a path forward and up. And, it's been really amazing. I've been, binge watching a couple things, actually much more the last couple of years than ever before, but I'll come clean about that. But the last few times I've watched, there's just been this running ad from Amazon going, we're paying $15 an hour. We treat people so great. And then the happy employees going, yay, yay, yay. And it's amazing to me how much they are pushing that narrative, and how other companies are starting to have to come out and say, hey, we're someplace where you want to work. And I think some are more sincere than others, but this question of recruiting and retention is such a huge workplace issue. And, all of the safety issues around people who do come into contact with clients are big, because this is not going to be the last pandemic the world has ever seen. Epidemiologists are already freaking out about what the next one might be.
Yeah. I think often it's the balance, isn't it, between supply and demand, as with any market. And if there's that kind of imbalance and the workers have got a bit more power, then of course you're going to see some shifts. But I think people have kind of overlooked, or maybe downplayed, or maybe sort of looked at too superficially the kind of Maslow hierarchy, and with safety being foundational, really. And it's not necessarily that people are making their businesses unsafe from a physical perspective, but there's this kind of, I talk a lot about the feeling safe, that feeling of protection and support. And if you don't have that, then if you've got options, you're not going to stay, are you? What are you doing there? You're going to try and find somewhere to work where you spend most of your life, really, that you get that feeling.
It raises all sorts of much bigger policy questions, really, that when people feel safe, they are more productive. And there's some employees where, if they don't feel like it's the right job and they go on to someplace better, that's good for the company and for the person. And we look at the way in the United States, for example, the way we provide healthcare, it's sort of companies' responsibility. And you'll see people who will stick in a job that they hate because they get healthcare. And, that when Obamacare came out a few years ago, this sort of, ability for anyone to get a healthcare plan themselves, that made it a lot easier to go and start your own business because it was easier to get healthcare. But we still have these huge fights going on over what the obligations of companies are to, to employees and to contract workers. And companies have shifted a lot more risk to the contract workers. And it used to be that if you were a consultant, you'd get so much more per hour, et cetera, than an employee, because, because they assumed you were paying for all those things themselves. And there's so many contractors and freelancers now that, that premium is not what it used to be. And I think it's time for a whole rethinking of this, because it's, the employers are not the most efficient providers of healthcare. And there are also, there's been some academic studies, some of which I touched on very, very briefly in You Are What You Risk, but saying that, that certain parts of the welfare state actually support entrepreneurship and this sort of capitalist economy. There's something that's just stories just come out of China, that there are some new pilot programs to offer startup loans to people just coming out of school, and it's forgivable up to a certain amount. And that's a very, very, very interesting proposition. And we've of course seen in the United States a lot of funds showered on small and big businesses just to get them through this this pandemic. And there's going to be a whole re-reckoning of what that risk ecosystem is going forward. What are the sort of social safety nets, public policy decisions that allow people to take more good risks, create jobs, and be entrepreneurs, go and educate yourself, whatever you're going to do, and to discourage the bad risk, the reckless credit card spending, or the moral hazard in big banks, and also rethink this risk umbrella. Who, quote unquote, deserves protection, and what are the benefits to society of creating certain protections? And those are very big questions about society, because the truth is, going all the way back to the people huddle around the campfire in the cave, every social group is about sharing the burden of protecting each other from risk, and protecting the most vulnerable and the people who are strongest taking on more of a burden. But from the cavemen to the first city states and nation states and nations, and now some of these international organizations dealing with global problems, those are all about mitigating risks. And I think that whole system is broken and needs a major, major rethink.
Yeah, I mean, the ticking time bomb here in the UK is around social care, and particularly for care for the elderly as well. As the US and most countries, aging population, and we've got this literally bomb exploding in front of our eyes. Or perhaps I shouldn't be using that analogy.
Not good timing, no.
No, but the huge cost of this, and who's going to pay for it? Because we've got our welfare state a bit different to you guys. We have free healthcare at the point of use, but what we have done historically is kind of, if people have had a certain level of assets, like a house, for example, that they've owned, at a point the government's been able to say, well, right, we're going to draw down against the value of that asset to pay for the care, but they're trying to get away from that, and they've actually started introducing, or they're going to introduce, I can't remember, some kind of insurance to sort of protect people against that. So it's moving maybe a little bit more to the US model of having some insurance to cover stuff, but it's very very controversial, very difficult to get right. I don't think you can ever appease everybody on that issue, and that's just one big example where we should, if you look in the mirror and say what's right and what's wrong, well, yeah, we should be looking after everybody, but what's the risk, what's the opportunity, what's the cost of doing all these things? And it's never an easy decision.
And I think it's a matter of changing the conversation. So you're not just talking about cost, but also the benefit. And climate change, for example, you get asked all the time, oh, what's the cost of the green transition, the clean transition? I'm like, okay, what's the cost of not doing it? And we don't spend enough time talking about avoided costs. You see all these studies about resilience, and every $1 invested, I've seen numbers from $4 to $12 in return, depending on the time period and who's doing the study and things like that. And our public policy systems aren't set up to calculate those avoided costs. And so I think we need a lot more scenario thinking going forward. what's the best case, what's the worst case, what are the second order effects, and how do we share those risk burdens fairly? You hear a lot of conversations about, private sector should do everything, government should do everything. And people aren't saying, okay, what are the situations where the government can do it better? What are the situations where the private sector can do it better? And where are public-private partnerships the way to go? So we're not even having the right conversation.
No. I also think there's something interesting, which is a little bit contrary to human nature in many ways, around this topic of risk, and probably risk more slanted towards safety, the safety end of risk. But people kind of seem to, in many walks of life, people are drawn to the positive. They're drawn to the prize rather than away from the pain. Whereas in this kind of world, talking about avoided costs and things like that, the benefits, that just doesn't seem to resonate as much with people. It's more about talking about what could go wrong and what are the bad things that might happen, and trying to give people the stick approach rather than the carrot approach. I don't know if that is your experience as well, or if you've got any thoughts on how we might be able to change that.
There's been a very interesting conversation around behavioral economics and the whole concept of loss aversion. And, you've seen the experiments whereby, students assign a greater value to a mug once they have it than, if they, didn't have it in the first place. And behavioral economics has done such a great job of showing how many biases that humans have and how each one of them works. But it's a very two-dimensional picture. And I don't think it goes enough into how much variability there is among humans in how that bias operates. And there have been some studies showing that, awareness of bias and processes and habits that help you to counteract them can actually reduce the likelihood that bias is going to mess you up. And I think it's a combination actually of this sort of risk fingerprint that I talk about, the innate personality, the kind of thing that the risk type compass shows, and your experiences. So, if you think about it as a real fingerprint, the personality is the arches and the whorls and the ridges in your finger that's genetically determined, you can't change. So then the experiences are the things that happen to you from outside, like you cut your finger, and that changes the fingerprint, and it also changes you. For some people are like, oh, I cut my finger, no big deal, and they're they just barrel on ahead and they're not so freaked out about the possibility of getting cut in the future. And other people, because of their innate personality, will be paranoid about knives going forward. And so it's this sort of interaction between the innate personality and then the experiences. And you can't really control the experiences beyond putting yourself in a certain situation to make one experience more likely. But the third part is the things that you can control. Going back to the actual finger, manual labor, ending up with really chapped hands, or putting nice, soft, raw shea butter on your hands. So it's, it's nice, but that's your habits. It's the people you surround yourself with. It's how self-aware you are about risk, what makes you more comfortable or less comfortable. It's about, bizarrely, the temperature in the room, the tempo of the music you're listening to, or how spicy the food is that you ate, those sort of environmental factors that you can control. And so when you put all of those three things together, be aware of your innate personality and what you can do. If you're a shrinking violet, what can you do to, get a little braver? And, if you're a leap before you look person, then, who can you bring into your life to get you to take 10 breaths before you do something? And so understanding how all three of those factors, the innate, the experience, and the environment and the choices that you make, affect all the risk decisions that you make. And that also affects how well you deal with uncertainty.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Now, I've got a podcast, right? So I must be a journalist. So I'm going to ask you a journalist question.
I'm ready for it.
I'm going to ask you, is this a grey rhino question? So a quote from your LinkedIn says, "A grey rhino is a high impact, high probability, obvious danger in business life or the world. Grey rhinos are all too likely to be, though are not inevitably, neglected despite their size and obviousness." Now, as I think you know, because we're connected on LinkedIn, my day job when I'm not hosting best-selling authors on podcasts is slips and falls. And now that to me is pretty close to, I don't know if it's exactly a grey rhino, but it's got to be ticking quite a few of those boxes. We've got hundreds of thousands of people in the UK going to hospital, billions of pounds of claims, but yet a lot of people overlook it and think it's not going to happen to them. So is that a good example of a grey rhino?
Well, it's interesting. I first came up with the concept in, high finance, thinking of the Argentinian debt crisis versus the Greek debt crisis, and Argentina missed an opportunity to kind of straighten things out and avoid chaos, and Greece didn't. But when I went out on book tour for the Grey Rhino, everybody kept asking me about how to apply it to their personal life, or they just tell me, this is how I applied it to my personal life. So I think everyday things like that absolutely can benefit from the same analysis. And I'm a big process person. I'm like, check to make sure the floor is mopped. I actually lost my tennis partner to, not permanently, but for several weeks, long enough for us to both lose interest in tennis, to a spill on the cafeteria floor that she ended up with a broken knee from it. But I think that there are lots of things that we could do, safety habits. And I think most people don't spend enough time thinking about safety, as I'm sure you don't. Talking to a lot of business continuity professionals, one of the biggest refrains that I would hear is, this stuff keeps us up at night, but how do we communicate it to other people? How do we get them to think about it? And, in terms of risk management, I know you were talking about, should we get rid of the risk management profession?
Yeah.
And the thing is, I think that the risk management profession needs to remember that it's not a silo, that there's a lot of risk management language that's very silo-y, that's very quanty, that's very, authoritative, when it's, when risk is actually a lot squishier than that. So I think it's a matter of reaching out, getting everybody to think much more about the risks in their lives, to understand how closely tied it is to every single decision we make. I've read, after the book came out, unfortunately, but I've read that we make, give or take, 35,000 choices a day.
Yeah.
Every single risk is a choice. Every single choice is a risk. And it's so important to our daily lives, to our professions, to our relationships, but we don't think about risk explicitly, even though it's everywhere. I've started, when I'm watching movies or listening to TV or reading books, this word risk just pops out at me all the time. And I'm much more aware of it now. And so it's that much more amazing to me that risk is such a part of our lives, but most of us don't deal with it head on. We don't have that reflective session about the role of risk in our lives, how our biases and perceptions affect the risks that we take. And that includes the sort of passive risks, which are the, not sweeping the floor, which is the, not getting rid of the ice. I'm in Chicago. It's the end of winter. That's kind of a sore subject. There's a couple buildings down the street that never get rid of the snow and ice. But it's part of being human. But we really need to have a much more open conversation about risk and build a bridge between the risk management profession and, everyday people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that is a great way to finish, because I think that's a nice theory, hypothesis, manifesto for us to live by. So thanks for that, Michele. What can people do to learn more? Obviously, they should be buying the books. Where can they buy the books? And connect on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever it might be. And have you got anything coming up, a new book or a webinar or anything like that that you'd like to sort of get out there and plug?
Well, every time I finish a book, that just finished a book me tells future self, next time you think about doing this, don't. And future self always remembers that moment and ignores just finished the book self. So that's all I'm going to say on that subject right now.
That must mean that writing a book is similar to having a baby. I don't know if you've got kids.
Yes, I use that all the time. Yes, you should only do it if you can't not do it.
Yeah, at the time, 2 days after giving birth, if you ask any woman, well, this is my experience, women that I know, would, you know, another no, it's horrendous. But then, you know, a year down the line, yeah, let's have another baby.
Yes, it's like well, I mean, I don't have any kids, but it's like it that way in that way as well. So, as you know, your favorite bookseller, I'm a big fan of independent bookstores. I don't know what the best one is in the UK, but in the US, it's bookshop.org. There's a bunch of places listed on my website, which is thegrayrhino.com. Gray with an A will get you there faster, but gray with an E will get you there. So don't worry about, you know, in hindsight, I wish I'd used the E because you know, I had no idea how global the book was going to become.
Yes.
But thegrayrhino.com, I'm on LinkedIn. I write regularly about all sorts of things. I'm on Twitter at Wucker, Wucker, and love to hear from people, love to connect on LinkedIn. And really, I see the books as conversations. You know, I don't want them to stay in between the covers, that they're really living, breathing things that nothing makes me happier than to see people putting those ideas to work in their daily lives. And when people do that and tell me how it is, I do a little happy dance.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Great. Well, thank you very much, Michele. I really appreciate you being generous with your time. Really, really enjoyed it. And who knows, when you've written the next book, we'll get you back on again.
Thanks so much, Christian. This has really been really fun talking with you.
Thanks.